It's time for another video on the topic of protest and revolution. Of course, here in the United States, they don't really report on anything outside of the country unless it enforces the government's opinion that we need more surveillance or whatever, or it's about crazed terrorists over in the Middle East. So again, I had to go to alternative media sources to actually find out this was happening because, of course, no mention on CNN or anywhere like that. Russia Today covered it, The Guardian covered it, plenty of people online covered it, but nothing from here. Brazil right now is erupting in huge protests. Of course, it was claimed there were 100,000 people in Sao Paulo. No, 60,000 people in Sao Paulo and 100,000 in Rio. And a whole bunch of people at, I think it was 20 different cities had massive, waves of protests, and there were smaller groups of people almost everywhere that were protesting or rioting. And essentially it boils down to the last straw for them was a bus fare hike. I can't remember whether it was a city hike or countrywide, but it's just another symptom in their long struggle over there because their government has raised taxes to an ungodly level and the people aren't actually seeing the benefits. The infrastructure and the public services, medicine, education aren't being benefited by these higher taxes like they were promised. So I can understand why they were protesting about that. There's also the Olympics, which are problematic for the average person in Brazil. Um, and there's corruption, of course. What seems to have happened, this is at least what I gathered from what was being claimed, what seems to have happened is that the Olympics were planned and everything was on budget. Then the politicians pocketed most of the money and raised taxes to make up the difference. So there's your corruption aspect, that the people started to protest and the police were beating them down. And so then, of course, that pissed everybody off and the protest just got 10 times larger, which seems to be a reasonable chain of events. Things like that do tend to happen. The police are too heavy-handed, and then people get up in arms, and then the police are outnumbered and can't do anything about it. And, of course, anyone looking at this story would feel sorry for the Brazilian population and support what they're doing. And I almost saw a little prophetic material in it related to the United States. Of course, we're being taxed and not seeing much benefit from that. We've got rampant corruption problems whereby the politicians end up pocketing millions where people, the average person, sees no benefit. It would be great if this sort of thing were to happen in the United States, and because of the population difference, of course, you could expect 3 times the numbers to turn out, which can you imagine 300,000 people protesting? It would be a magnificently huge crowd. No police force would be able to contain them unless they resorted to deadly force, essentially. And it would be nice to see that happen. You see a difference, of course, in the developing world. People don't have as much attachment necessarily to their lives because they might not have a job. They're too poor to afford anything, even if they're working 60 hours a week. So they have nothing to lose by protesting. Here in the United States, the average person is so attached to their 2-car garage and their picket fence, they don't have time to protest. Well, everything's swell to me. Nothing's going on that I'll change, so I'll just go to work, be a slave like usual, which is ridiculous. Of course, the Brazilians, hopefully, they were actually trying to get into the congressional building. Apparently, they tried to break into the governor's mansion at in one of their provinces or counties. I'm not sure which they use. It was interesting to see. I mean, literally, I was watching it live as these protesters were slowly getting closer to the congressional building. And finally, the police were inside the building and they were lining the sides. But the protesters were all over the lawn, thousands of them. They climbed up on the roof. There were thousands of people dancing up on the roof, and it was wonderful. I assume a pleasurable time was had by all, showing the government they were tired of it. And the thing is, even when such a protest doesn't topple a government, you can still usually expect at least modest reform because the government gets worried when hundreds of thousands of people at the same time sort of march through the streets. There's not much that the police can do. They would have to call in the military to stop it. And they don't like to do that because then popular revolution can begin. And they take that risk. They roll the dice and they're not sure exactly what's going to happen. So I support this movement, and a lot of people were saying in the beginning, sort of trying to trash the movement, oh, this was a communist movement, or this was some sort of hyper-religious movement that they wanted a Christian government. And that's actually not the case. That I'm not sure where that idea came from. Maybe a wrong translation of some slogan, or specific group of protesters, but that doesn't seem to actually be the case. It has to do with removing corruption. And these sort of revolutions or protests or riots, pickets, strikes, whatever you want to call them, whatever form they take, are generally good. Generally speaking, a population is very lawful and orderly. Generally speaking, a population will not raise its fists to the sky and take to the streets unless something significant is going on that they're pissed off about. And the larger the turnout, typically the more corruption they see. Of course, the Occupy Wall Street movement, millions of people were taking to the streets then because of corruption, because they saw problems that needed to be addressed. They were tired of it, and they took to the streets. You could say the same about the Tea Party movement. Of course, when you get tens of thousands of people dressed as Revolutionary War soldiers marching down the street, you know that something is amiss that people are concerned about. And a lot of times, the average workaday individual, or the people who supported whoever is politically holding office at the time, denigrate these movements. You see a lot of people that, for instance, trying to put down Occupy Wall Street, the Tea Party, the Brazilian protesters, the Turkish protesters, any of these groups. You see a lot of people that condemn them. Generally, these people who condemn them are they're either comfortable workaday individuals. They tend to be older. They have a stable job. They're not hurting. Generally, they feel comfortable with the way life is. Typically, they can remember the past. They can remember things are marginally less difficult now, and so they see no need for reform. And it's not necessarily their fault. I mean, sometimes they're just brainwashed, but other times it is their fault and they're just being blowhards. Other individuals, of course, for instance, here in the United States, they support Obama because they like Obama. They like his policies. They honestly do like those policies. And so any infringement upon the government's power they see as a bad thing, not, of course, realizing in the long run that the same abuses can apply to their party if the other party takes control. And that's, again, what I think you see in Brazil with some people who are up in arms about these protests. These protests are reasonable. There's a reasonable, logical, well thought out reason why these people are taking to the streets, and they should be supported. You can see plenty of videos of the police brutality too. For instance, when protesters are a small group of protesters, they're not threatening anyone. They're not throwing, rocks through windows. They're essentially saying no violence. And I don't know Portuguese, so I can't say it in their language. But when they're just sitting there chanting no violence, and then the police all of a sudden show up with gas grenades and flashbangs and start firing rubber bullets and beating people down and forcing them off the streets, that's brutality. It's a textbook example of police brutality, of them overreacting to a situation. And in such situations, yes, sometimes the police can be excused by saying it was a tense situation, maybe they just got beat on themselves, they have no clue what's going on, they're confused. They're supposed to be more well organized than that. The better organized the police force is, hopefully, generally speaking, unless something significant is happening, they're not going to start beating on people. In this case, in Brazil, of course, you saw that brutality, and then all of a sudden 10 times more people came out on the streets to protest that, and the police were apparently given the order not to do anything. That essentially there were too many people. It was too much of a powder keg situation. There were too many people. They couldn't even risk it. So they essentially took up positions around important buildings, held their lines, and let the protesters go wild, and just put out fires as the protesters moved on to new areas. And it's almost sad to see that the corruption that we deal with in the United States is on the same order of magnitude as those that we see in Turkey and Brazil, yet there you have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people taking to the streets, and here you see very little. You see there are some people that are planning protests, but they're not spontaneous. So hopefully in the long run they're well thought out and they'll actually gain traction. The worst case scenario is that all interest will blow over before they even happen. So I support the Brazilian protests, and I supported the Turkish protests, and I think there should be more protests here. Even if you don't have a reason to protest, you should still protest anyway, because it's one of your rights, and the government will trot on it if you don't. So think about that one for a minute. People need to exercise that right. Anywhere that they already have a right, they should exercise it at will, even if just for the purpose of not having it removed. And that's a lesson that everyone should learn. And thank goodness for the Brazilians